Welcome to Demonic Diaries, the YouTube channel where we explore the darkest corners of the human mind. Join me, your host, as I delve into the pages of terrifying tales and haunting stories. From the depths of hell to the darkest depths of the human psyche, we'll be your guide through the most bone-chilling and spine-tingling stories that will keep you up at night. So buckle up and prepare to be scared, because on Demonic Diaries, every story has a dark side. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell to be notified of new videos. Let's get started. Number 1. I live in a college dorm in the middle of nowhere. I live in a college dorm out in the middle of nowhere. To be specific, nowhere is this industrial wasteland located on the very outskirts of the city, and for some strange reason, had a name slapped on it, despite being nothing but an amalgamation of busy highways and smoking factories, perpetually choked by waves of soot and ash, as though this pseudo-town had tripped and skidded a million years ahead into nuclear winter. To the students who regularly commuted between the city and college, the town was like an ugly janitor's closet affixed to a limousine. Except that this janitor's closet had one of the top universities in the country set up in pristine condition behind all the mops and plungers and cans of bleach. The scenery in nowhere was the same everywhere along perfectly straight roads, surrounded on all sides by ash-covered gray vegetation, the straw roofs of fresh hovels, the crumbling foundations of old houses jutting through the pallid green. On these roads, at all times, were gigantic lorries, each hurtling by with its own colorful corporate logo inscribed onto its sides. Looking at it for more than a minute could give you this strange sensory vertigo, your mind grappling with the monstrous size of capitalism as every other second, a new, completely original, totally distinct image would flash by. John used to joke that a caveman would have burst a blood vessel if he stared at the highway for more than 5 seconds. However, it was like the highway absorbed all the violently functioning pandemonium of everyday life into itself, and away from the surrounding grasslands nothing moved there, nothing made a fucking sound. Rows and rows of hovels, and we'd never see a single living inhabitant. The only time I saw animals was whenever I was in the hostel, and this one time I'd seen a puppy trotting through the roads, covered in soot like some overworked Victorian orphan, and completely alone. This sight had carved itself into my brain like some biblical image, striking, moving, a million volumes of morals and humanist lamentation brimming underneath. I digress. ADHD makes you bad at telling stories, but damn does it help you reach the word count. I live in a dorm built in the campus of one of the top universities in my country. This university is located for some mysterious reason in nowhere. To get into the University of Nowhere, I embraced a sad, lonely high school life, filled with study sessions set to the tunes of alternative rock, and punctuated by quiet family dinners with my Asian parents. For a change, I chose the dorm life instead of the commute, and I got what I wanted, at least partially. I was never alone again. Dinners were never quiet again. I've been living in the dorm for about a year now. The first time I saw a door was when I was 6 months into college, but even before that little cosmic fright, I'd seen plenty of disturbing things in the hostel. This first story involves my childhood friend, John, vanishing off the face of the earth for no conceivable, rational reason at all. For the sake of anonymity, and also so that no one ever needs to know where these stories take place, I'm going to use made-up generic names for my roommates John, Doe and Ant. This one time, my roommates had left to get a second serving of dinner or something, and it was just me, sitting on my bed and brooding about a fuckton of work that a senior at the Speakers Club, another club with made-up positions and made-up problems, had given me. I'd switched on a single light bulb that glowed a beautiful, uninterrupted white, taken fresh out of the supplies closet, because the previous one had exploded the very day my 3 roommates and I moved in. The breathing began from Ant's bed. Violent, labored breaths, like someone was fighting for their life under my roommate's bed, but also excruciatingly slowly, one dying breath rising up from his absolutely motionless bed every second. My brain came up with a million explanations that all had to do with the wind, but my legs were scrambling with an athletic prowess that would have gotten me into the track team with my man crush back in 10th grade. My room was divided into 2 halves, each half occupied by 2 beds that were glued to each other, but separated by one thick tall fender, so that it almost looked like the room was divided into 4 different sectors. At each corner was a single gigantic locker provided by the dorm, where we put our own clothes and laptops and stuff. Now, I was scrambling over to John's bed, which is glued to mine. Why I didn't just turn that doorknob and walk out the room, I have no idea. The breathing stopped for a few moments, and this stretch of silence was more terrifying than the preceding moments, because I had no fucking idea what was going to happen. The breathing erupted from my bed, painfully strained, almost a scream at this point. It was like the man was being buried, taking his last remaining gulps of air through holes in the soil, rapidly being sealed by worms and pebbles, until nature had crawled down his esophagus and choked him to death. It stopped again, abruptly. A few moments later, I heard a few faint breaths over from Doe's bed on the other side. Shock clouding my mind, I waited patiently for the breathing to surface under John's bed. It did not. I waited for a few minutes. Then I opened the door, switched off the light and took a long piss. They were playing cards in the other room, and I hovered nervously about the door for several moments before walking in. Just like that, my episode dissolved in a barbaric blood-soaked game of Uno. When I finally walked back to my room after being forcibly kicked out by them, my roommates were already fast asleep. Obligatory calls to girlfriends and mothers and fathers finished. I lay on my bed. I stared up at the ceiling for a long time. My shoulders felt like blocks of wood, the mattress stiff and unwelcoming. I counted the bars in the windows, and when that didn't work because I kept remembering the breathing, I tried another sleep technique of mine where I'd run through a little fantasy world in my head. It had always worked for me since I was a little kid. I woke up less than an hour later to the worst sound I'd heard in my entire life. My roommates were up, phone flashlights pointed at John's locker, their expressions like gargoyles in the darkness. Something banged on the locker, screaming like it was being murdered, screaming the same 6 words over and over again. The worms are in my eyes. The locker did not budge an inch, but the banging was so violent that it felt like the floor would split. The screaming degenerated into choked breaths after a few seconds, the voice cleaving into gasps, then eventually into nothing. John, who had been standing near the door the whole time, was the first to say something. "What the fuck?" And walked to the locker door, threw it open even as John hurled as many swears at him as he could fit into a single breath. The smell of earth and decay flooded the room. It was so strong, so overpowering that our brains were genuinely having trouble believing where we were, and I flashed back and forth between the room and this image of a moss-eaten crypt in my head. John hit the light switch, and the scent was immediately gone. There was nothing in John's locker but clothes, cables, and a bunch of rolled-up weekend posters. We all decided not to sleep and watched Doe play The Sims 4 until late in the morning, and then we packed our bags and went to college. 3 days later, John came back from playing badminton to find a colony of blue-colored fungus growing on his bed. It wasn't that big of a deal at the time, and we just called in the housekeepers to take care of it, and they did. The next day, he found around 20 dead snails under his bed, shells scattered in one corner, their mangled dried corpses strewn about in a formation that clearly formed some shape, but no shape that our conscious mind was able to recognize. As though our brain was refusing to tell its name, refusing to let us comprehend it any further than a haphazard smattering of snails on the floor. After the initial shock, we called in the housekeepers yet again, and they swept them into plastic bags while we stood outside the room and watched. From that day onwards, we began to scratching noises from within John's locker. A light bang, now and then. The door would creak slightly. After opening the locker about 100 times and finding nothing, we decided to just ignore it. Poor John though, having to sleep next to that thing every day. One day, we were all crouched over our tables doing our engineering drawing assignments. We had about a dozen shapes to carefully construct, and every so often a friend from another department would walk in, look at what we were drawing, and ask us why we were drawing bug plugs, laugh to themselves, and then walk out. About 4 shapes in, I fell asleep on the desk, earphones still streaming Sigur Rós into my dreams. When John woke me up, all 4 of the lights in the room were switched off except for mine. I removed the earphones, turned around to face him, and saw that his face was utterly still like that of a doll's, petrified by panic. I asked him what was going on, and he told me he was hearing something from the locker for an hour now. I walked over to his side of the room, pressed my ear to the locker door. It was crying. Hysterically. It sobbed like a machine. We both looked at each other. "It'll stop if we open it," John said. "It always does," I said. I opened it. It stopped. John illuminated the inside with his phone's flashlight. There was a faint whistling coming from underneath John's clothes. "What are you doing?" he asked as I started throwing his clothes out of the locker and onto his bed. I moved away from the locker and told him to lean in. His jaw tightened. "I've been hearing it since the day we found the fungus on the bed. I could only hear it if I listened really hard. I didn't even know it was coming from this locker." We emptied out his locker, quietly laying his belongings on his bed, so as to not wake the other 2. Then we pointed our phones at the locker, now an empty echo chamber, amplifying the sound of the whistling until it felt like it was right in our ears. We both saw it at the same time. 2 tiny holes punctured through the lower half of the locker. John leaned in closer to look at it. That's where the breathing is coming from. I heard it too. The sound of faint faltering breaths blowing through those 2 holes. We moved the locker. There was nothing behind it but plain walls with peeling paint. We both stood there for a very long time, staring at the holes. John began gathering his clothes, throwing them back into the locker. I'm going to sleep. We have to submit those assignments tomorrow morning. Remembering my extremely incomplete engineering drawing assignment jolted me out of whatever existential dread I had been feeling at the moment, so I also decided to think about the locker later and go to sleep. A week before John moved out of our hostel room, he told he was having dreams. In one of them, something was watching him from the locker. In the other one, he was being buried alive, dirt and rocks being shoveled onto him, the pitch-black, starless night sky vanishing from his vision, patch by patch, until dirt filled his eyes and worms filled his lungs. And he lay there, decomposing for 100 years, listening to rocks crumble atom by atom to bury him even deeper. He would wake up the next morning, having lived 100 years in the night, and he'd have to pack his assignments and his notes into his bag and go to college. I never asked him about the locker after that night. I wish I had. The day before he vanished off the face of the earth, about 5 months after he'd moved out of the hostel room, he walked right into my class in the middle of a lecture and told me to unblock the 2 holes. He'd hammered nails into them after stuffing paper into them didn't work. He pressed the key to the locker into my hand. I never saw him again. In the months since he'd moved out, the locker had given us no trouble, but in the span of these 5 months, I'd seen things in the hostel that were far, far worse than John's little paranormal scuffle with his locker. Yes, things even worse than having to dream of your entire body rotting away, cell by cell, for 100 years in your sleep. So I obliged him. I unlocked the locker door with Anne standing behind me, flashing the light as I swung the door open. The insides were washed with crimson fungus. Like mold, but blood red, covering the whole interior like a wallpaper. Not an inch of the locker's metal peeked through the fungal layer. The smell was so bad that Ant stumbled away, dropping the phone on his bed and staggering out of the room. Before slamming the door shut, I saw the 2 nails hammered into the holes. Blood seeped from around the nails, dripping in a steady, tenuous stream down onto the fungus below. The fungus absorbed the blood, turning even redder, its webbing spreading over other webs, releasing a fresh stream of fluids. Like I said, stranger things have happened in this hostel like the doors, which I haven't even gotten around to telling you about. So maybe, when things calm down, I'll grab something flammable and torch that fucking locker. To wrap up this story, the last time anyone saw John was the very night after this. He was wearing a blue shirt, a backpack and sunglasses, and had a very visible skin infection, purple tendrils crisscrossing his neck and cheeks. He'd attacked one of the security guards at the gate, beating him over the head with a piece of wood until one of his eyes popped out, and walked into the college's abandoned humanities building at 2 a.m. in the night. No one ever saw him again. The police nor the dogs ever found a trace of him. However, we did. The day after he vanished, Anne came to me and told me to open the locker. I didn't ask him why we had to pursue whatever thin leads we had. A red shirt was plastered to the fungal walls, soaked in fluids, squelching as the tendrils slithered across it. 2 fingers were stuffed into the holes. We heard crying. Faint, familiar crying. We always kept the locker door slightly ajar after that. Number 2. Caution clings to my words, for a man is haunting our dreams. I pray you read this with care, for it may save your life. This man was once my friend, until he transformed into something beyond comprehension. It all began on the 24th of March in 2023. Dante's birthday had passed just days before, so we decided to celebrate with a few drinks and good times. The group consisted of 5 guys, including myself. Dante, in particular, was curious about LSD, and had managed to get his hands on some. As the night progressed, Dante began to experiment with the hallucinogenic drug. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but slowly, his behavior became increasingly bizarre. His eyes fixed on an empty wall, and his face twisted into an unsettling smirk. Dante's behavior escalated into a frenzy of shrieks and screams. He sprang up from his chair and ran to the bathroom. He shoved toothbrushes into his ears, causing blood to flow from them. Then, he cut his own mouth and charged towards us with a terrifying grin. Before I could react, Dante had killed 3 of my friends with inhuman speed and precision. I had to act fast to survive, so I impaled him with a broken bottle as he leaped towards me. Dante fell to the ground, dead. But little did I know the damage had already been done. That night, I dreamed of him. But it wasn't the Dante I knew, it was something else entirely. His eyes were lifeless, his skin pale, and his movements jerky and unnatural. I sensed that if I moved, I would perish, so I remained still until I woke. Days turned into weeks, and the more I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, the more I realized that I was being stalked by something beyond comprehension. I would hear whispers in the dead of night, footsteps pacing the floors of my home, and every time I would catch a glimpse of him, his eyes would bore into my soul, sending chills down my spine. As time passed, the hunting became more intense, and I could feel his presence closing in on me. I began to lose my mind, and with every passing day, I could feel my sanity slipping away. Sleep is a luxury I didn't have, for the fear of him kept me awake, and even my waking hours were spent in a constant state of fear. I haven't slept since the first time seeing him in my dream. In a desperate attempt to rid myself of this nightmare, I turned to occult rituals and ancient texts. I performed every exorcism and cleansing ritual known to man, but nothing seemed to work. The entity that was once my friend had become something far more sinister, something beyond human comprehension. And so, I have resigned myself to my fate. I know that the end is near, and that my final moments will be spent in agony, consumed by the darkness that has plagued me for these past 2 weeks. But if there's one thing I can do before I go, it is to warn others of the dangers that lurk in the shadows, to urge them to stay away from the temptations of the unknown, for once you cross that threshold, there may be no turning back. If you've encountered this man in your dreams, heed my warning. Lock your doors, keep the lights on, and do not fall asleep. If you do, be ready to wake yourself up or stay perfectly still, for he will hunt you down and claim your life. Caution clings to my words, for a man is hunting our dreams. I pray you read this with care, for it may save your life. This man was once my friend, until he transformed into something beyond comprehension. It all began on the 24th of March in 2023. Dante's birthday had passed just days before, so we decided to celebrate with a few drinks and good times. The group consisted of 5 guys, including myself. Dante, in particular, was curious about LSD, and had managed to get his hands on some. As the night progressed, Dante began to experiment with the hallucinogenic drug. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but slowly, his behavior became increasingly bizarre. His eyes fixed on an empty wall, and his face twisted into an unsettling smirk. Dante's behavior escalated into a frenzy of shrieks and screams. He sprang up from his chair and ran to the bathroom. He shoved toothbrushes into his ears, causing blood to flow from them. Then, he cut his own mouth and charged towards us with a terrifying grin. Before I could react, Dante had killed 3 of my friends with inhuman speed and precision. I had to act fast to survive, so I impaled him with a broken bottle as he leaped towards me. Dante fell to the ground, dead. But little did I know the damage had already been done. That night, I dreamed of him. But it wasn't the Dante I knew, it was something else entirely. His eyes were lifeless, his skin pale, and his movements jerky and unnatural. I sensed that if I moved, I would perish, so I remained still until I woke. Days turned into weeks, and the more I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, the more I realized that I was being stalked by something beyond comprehension. I would hear whispers in the dead of night, footsteps pacing the floors of my home, and every time I would catch a glimpse of him, his eyes would bore into my soul, sending chills down my spine. As time passed, the hunting became more intense, and I could feel his presence closing in on me. I began to lose my mind, and with every passing day, I could feel my sanity slipping away. Sleep is a luxury I didn't have, for the fear of him kept me awake, and even my waking hours were spent in a constant state of fear. I haven't slept since the first time seeing him in my dream. In a desperate attempt to rid myself of this nightmare, I turned to occult rituals and ancient texts. I performed every exorcism and cleansing ritual known to man, but nothing seemed to work. The entity that was once my friend had become something far more sinister, something beyond human comprehension. And so, I have resigned myself to my fate. I know that the end is near, and that my final moments will be spent in agony, consumed by the darkness that has plagued me for these past 2 weeks. But if there's one thing I can do before I go, it is to warn others of the dangers that lurk in the shadows, to urge them to stay away from the temptations of the unknown, for once you cross that threshold, there may be no turning back. If you've encountered this man in your dreams, heed my warning. Lock your doors, keep the lights on, and do not fall asleep. If you do, be ready to wake yourself up or stay perfectly still, for he will hunt you down and claim your life. Number 3. She won't leave me alone and it's getting worse. She never goes away, and it is getting worse. I have always been a little different. Quite a loner if I'm being honest. I always preferred doing things myself. Ever since I could walk. Nobody ever really liked me. My classmates always thought I was the weird kid. But that's not the point of the story. See, things have gotten very weird. A few years ago I met the love of my life. It was right before COVID hit and ruined everything. Me and this girl did everything together. I was around her all the time and we were inseparable. Every night I would go to her house. She wasn't very liked either. People thought she was a weird person. I will never think that no matter what happened. One night on October 28, 2021 I was waiting for her to pick me up. Once I got to her house something felt different. I ignored it and we ended up falling asleep on her bed. About an hour later I awoke into her getting out of bed and things went down from there. She died. For the next few weeks her death would replay in my head over and over. Then it stopped. But it gets worse. It started small. She would be in my bed with me sometimes or she would be standing in my room. Never speaking. Then she started talking to me. She followed me everywhere I went. We would have conversations back and forth like we always did. But it got worse. My mind has always been a little weird. I always had a feeling as if someone was watching me. As if everybody was out to get me. But this is different. She started telling me how much everybody hated me and how everybody wished I was dead. She would watch me suffer and tell me that somebody was going to kill me. One day I screamed at her to leave me alone. She told me she would kill me when she seen me again. Now I'm terrified. I have seen her a few times. So now I do not feel safe. I moved to a new place, made all new social media. The people around me think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. They all say she's dead, but I know she's somehow haunting me. This has been going on for a year now. I'm going to so many doctors and therapists over all this, but it never gets any better. But ever since I moved she's been gone. Well, that was until last week. I had just gotten a new piercing because I cope by getting things like piercings and stuff like that. Right before that I had a doctor's appointment. When I went to go get my piercing something felt off. Once I was finished I got back into my car. Until I felt like someone was watching me. Looking around my car and finding nothing wasn't a big shock to me. I felt the need to drive by her house and I was going to see how her mom was doing. I think that may have been the biggest mistake of my life. I drove by her neighborhood twice but wouldn't go in it. When I finally built up the courage I saw something. Standing on the lawn was my girlfriend. But this was different. Her hair was thin and looked like a lot had fallen out. Her body was super thin. Her skin was so awfully pale. Her hands were so thin and her fingers were longer. On those hands her nails were sharp. And her eyes. Oh, her eyes were black. I drove my car away as fast as I could. But now I can't sleep for the fear that she is after me once again. I've moved so she doesn't know where I am, but what if she finds me? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of the human psyche. We hope these tales have left you with a healthy respect for the unknown. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel for more bone-chilling content. And as always, keep the lights on and stay safe out there.